There is absolutely nothing glamorous to brag about when you tell people you work the night shift at the city morgue. If anything, it usually kills the conversation at parties. But for a pre-med student scraping by in Chicago, this job was a strange kind of blessing. It allowed me to attend my daytime classes without missing a beat, and, more importantly, it gave me hours of uninterrupted quiet time in the dead of night to study. I've always found a bizarre sense of peace here. Tucked away in their numbered drawers, with their toe tags neatly attached, the dead are incredibly respectful roommates. They would never bother me while I was racking my brain, wrestling with the complexities of integral calculus and organic chemistry. At least, that was what I had always believed. It was a typical Tuesday evening when I arrived at the grim concrete building to relieve Olaf Daly for the shift change. Olaf was an institution in this place, a grumpy, weathered old man who seemed permanently stiffened by the very profession he clung to. Between his advancing age and a pronounced limp in his right leg, he spent his entire day shift counting the minutes until I walked through the door so he could hand over the keys and escape. As always, our exchange was brief. He mumbled a guttural sound that served simultaneously as a greeting and a farewell. For a guy with a bad leg, it was always astonishing how fast he could hobble out of the morgue the second his shift was done. Left completely alone in the silent outer reception room, I went through my nightly ritual. I unpacked my thermos of black coffee, set up my small battery-operated radio, arranged my heavy medical textbooks on the metal desk, and finally pulled the massive, oversized logbook toward me to review the day's intake. Olaf had meticulously recorded the daily arrivals and departures in his distinct, spidery handwriting. It was a somber catalog of the city's daily tragedies. One drowning victim from Lake Michigan, an elderly couple who had perished in a severe car crash on the interstate, a guy who had fallen into such a deep, drunken sleep that he didn't wake up when his apartment building caught fire, a young man fatally stabbed in a street brawl, and a woman whose body was found floating down the river. Olaf's daily routine was usually just a steady, predictable rhythm of the unfortunate. For the past week, there hadn't been anything particularly remarkable or out of the ordinary. Except, of course, for the bizarre old woman who had occupied drawer number 14 last week. In a city like Chicago, you hear all sorts of urban legends, but this woman was something else. Rumor had it she was a witch. She even proudly called herself the fourth witch of Endor, and surprisingly, a lot of superstitious folks in her neighborhood actually believed her. She lived in a run-down, low-income district, making her living in the shadows by telling fortunes, holding seances, predicting lottery numbers, and selling strange amulets and hexes. Despite her eerie profession, her neighbors swore she had never actually harmed anyone. Then, on one suffocatingly hot summer night, she climbed to the roof of her 6-story apartment complex. No one ever figured out if she simply slipped on the gravel roofing, or if she was genuinely trying to fly to the moon and failed miserably. But the next morning, she was found splattered across the hot asphalt right in front of the building. They scraped her up and brought her down here, assigning her to the freezing metal confines of drawer 14. She lay in that deep freeze for 4 days until some distant, obscure relative from out of state finally showed up to claim the body. But according to Olaf, the old witch hadn't entirely left the premises. Just yesterday, the old man had looked at me with dead serious eyes and said, "I swear to God, there's a smell lingering in drawer 14. It smells exactly like sulfur." I hadn't noticed a thing. My sinuses were so constantly stuffed up with the harsh smells of formaldehyde and the chemical odors of my university lab, where I was constantly struggling to keep up with my classmates, that I couldn't have smelled a sulfur pit if I fell into one. Shaking off the memory, I closed the heavy logbook and decided to do my routine patrol of the facility. The adjacent cold room was bathed in bright, harsh, fluorescent light, yet it remained profoundly cold, expansive, and utterly devoid of life. The tiled floor was immaculately clean, radiating the faint, clinical scent of strong disinfectants. Over on the far side was the large industrial loading door where the transport vans backed in to deliver their silent cargo. And right next to it sat the long stainless steel gurney with its locking caster wheels. Luckily, it was empty at the moment, wiped down and gleaming, patiently waiting for its next use. The massive refrigeration units hummed with a low, constant rumble that you only really noticed if you stopped to listen for it. To my right, towering like a giant macabre beehive, were row upon row of stainless steel drawers. These were the temporary holding cells for the deceased, waiting for grieving families to claim them, or, if no one came, waiting for the state to finally pitch in and bury them in a potter's field out of charity. Any drawer that currently housed a body had a tag attached to it, looking disturbingly like a luggage tag you'd see in the cargo hold of an airplane or a cruise ship. The tags were hooked securely onto the thick metal handles of the drawers. I started whistling a low, tuneless melody, mostly just to inject some kind of human sound into the crushing silence of the room, and began walking down the aisle, cross-checking the tags against the list I had just memorized from Olaf's logbook. As I approached the section housing drawer 14, I suddenly stopped and sniffed the frigid air. Ah, so this is the sulphur smell old man Olaf was talking about, I muttered to myself, a bitter, pungent odor suddenly hitting the back of my throat. I took one step past the drawer, then violently jolted, my head snapping back, and I spun my entire body around to face it. Olaf hadn't recorded any new intake for drawer 14 in the logbook, but there, dangling from the metal handle, was a cardboard tag. I leaned forward, reaching my hand out, my whistling dying on my lips. I grabbed the tag and flipped it over. Then I flipped it again. Once, twice, and then a third time, my fingers moving faster with a sudden spike of anxiety. I stood up straight and vigorously scratched my head. Both sides of the tag were completely blank. There was absolutely nothing written on it. Now, old man Olaf might have been getting on in years, and his knees were shot, but his mind was sharp. He was nowhere near senile. Forgetting to write a John or Jane Doe's name on a toe tag? He had never, ever made a mistake like that in all the years I'd known him. A nervous smirk crept onto my face. The old geezer was trying to pull a fast one on me. I never would have guessed he had a dark sense of humor like this. I managed to force out a whistle again, trying to sound completely unfazed and cool, but the tune came out flat and entirely unconvincing. Grabbing the cold metal handle, I gave it a hard yank. The drawer, sliding smoothly on its heavy-duty bearings, rolled out with a loud metallic shk. My whistling instantly died in my throat. There was a young woman lying in there. She had striking blonde hair, looked incredibly young, and was undeniably beautiful, despite the undeniable fact that she was dead. I stood paralyzed, staring down at her, feeling my toes instinctively curling up tight inside my boots. Her facial features were remarkably delicate, her pale skin as smooth as silk. Her eyes were softly closed, as peacefully as if she were merely taking a nap, framed by long, thick, dark eyelashes. She was dressed in a crisp, white nurse's uniform. The only item that offered even the slightest clue to her identity was a delicate silver chain bracelet fastened around her cold wrist. Engraved onto the small metal plate of the bracelet were just two letters, Z-L. Panic finally overrode my shock. I spun on my heels and sprinted out of the cold room back to the reception desk. I practically tackled the logbook, tearing through the pages. I desperately didn't want to falsely accuse Olaf of incompetence. I scanned the day's entries. Nothing. I stared blankly, then ran my finger down the list a second time. Still, nothing. I frantically flipped back to yesterday's records, and then the day before that. Absolutely no one matching her description had been assigned to drawer 14. I pursed my lips, trying to whistle to calm my racing heart, but no sound came out. I slowly walked back to the heavy door of the cold room. The upper half of the door featured two reinforced glass windows. Allow me to peer inside without having to actually open it and step back into the freezing air. Drawer 14 was still pulled out, exactly as I had left it, and the blonde nurse, ZL, was still lying there, an immovable, chilling presence. My legs felt like jelly. I carefully lowered myself into my desk chair, pulled a handkerchief from my pocket, and wiped the cold sweat beading on my forehead. Taking a long, shuddering breath, I picked up the heavy receiver of the rotary phone and dialed Olaf's home number. As the phone rang in my ear, my eyes stayed locked on the cold room door. A woman's voice answered, thick with sleep. "Oh, I'm sorry," Olaf's wife mumbled. "My husband Olaf isn't home yet." Then her tone shifted slightly, becoming a bit more alert. "Hold on a second. I hear him unlocking the door now." A moment later, after a gruff clearing of the throat, Olaf's gravelly voice barked through the receiver.
Yeah? What is it?
"It's Tully Branson, Mr. Daly," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "If you're calling to ask me to cover your shift so you can go out drinking with your frat buddies, the answer is no," he snapped. "No, nothing like that," I replied hastily. I need to ask you about the girl in drawer 14. "There is nobody in drawer 14, Tully," Olaf said, his voice flat and annoyed. "Yes, there is, sir," I insisted. "A blonde woman. She's wearing a uniform. She's young, really beautiful. It's an absolute tragedy. You must remember her. You probably just forgot to log her intake." I heard Mrs. Daly murmuring a question in the background, followed by Olaf muttering away from the mouthpiece. "I bet this Branson kid brought a bottle of booze into work tonight." "I did not, sir," I fired back defensively. "I mean, I like a beer as much as the next guy, but I'd never bring alcohol into the morgue. I'm completely sober. It's just the blonde girl in 14. You forgot to log her." "How the hell would I forget something like that?" Olaf growled. "She's here. If you don't believe me, come down here and look for yourself," I challenged him, my anxiety masking itself as frustration. "Oh, I'll be coming down there, boy," Olaf roared. "An oversight like this is a massive violation. You don't play games with this." He slammed the phone down so hard the violent crack almost blew out my eardrum. Trembling, I gently placed my receiver back on the cradle. I reached for my thermos, poured a splash of black coffee into the plastic cup, pulled a cigarette from my pack, and lit it with a shaky hand. I took a sip of the scalding coffee, then reached to light my cigarette. I took another sip, screwed the cup back onto the thermos, reached for my pack again, and suddenly realized I had already lit 2 cigarettes and left them both burning on the edge of the glass ashtray. I let out a weak, pathetic chuckle, shaking my head at my own frayed nerves, and stubbed one out to save for later in the long night ahead. It didn't take long. With a heavy, uneven, furious gait, Olaf stormed through the front doors looking like a battleship sailing straight into a hurricane. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated rage, but I simply offered a polite, confident smile, knowing I was right, and gestured for him to lead the way into the cold room. He shoved through the heavy swinging doors, and I followed closely on his heels. Drawer 14 was still fully extended, exactly where I had left it. Olaf didn't even bother to walk all the way over to it. He took one look from the doorway and immediately spun around to face me. "Branson," he snarled, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "If I were 20 years younger, I'd smash your face in right now." "Mr. Daly," I started. "You'd drag a tired old man out of his house in the middle of the night to come back to this foul-smelling pit for a sick prank?" he yelled. "And here I was, actually thinking you were a decent kid." "But, Mr. Daly," I pleaded. "There is no but," he roared. "I am reporting this. You're done." I stared past him at drawer 14 like a complete lunatic. She was still right there, A solid, undeniable mass. Blonde, beautiful, and dead. Olaf shoved me roughly aside and started marching toward the exit. Panic seized me. I reached out and grabbed his arm. I might have been young, but I was a grown man, and I wasn't going to let him gaslight me. "Mr. Daly!" I shouted. "You see her! I know you see her!" "Take your hands off me!" he bellowed, violently jerking his arm away. "What I see is a completely empty drawer, exactly like the inside of your empty head." I stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "I'm not playing a joke, sir. Neither am I," he spat directly into my face. "What kind of sick nonsense is this?" "Just go look closer at the drawer. Stop messing with me," I begged, my voice cracking. "I already looked." There is nothing there except a disrespectful punk who thought it would be funny to drag an old man out of his bed for a laugh. He shoved past me with surprising strength, making a beeline for the reception area. When he reached the front door, he stopped, turned back, and jabbed a thick, calloused finger in my direction. "Listen to me, kid. Do yourself a favor and start looking for a new job tomorrow morning." And with that, he turned and stormed out into the Chicago night, the door slamming shut behind him with a terrifying finality. I was alone again. Alone with the hum of the refrigerators, the smell of sulphur, and the blonde nurse that only I could see. The heavy metal door of the reception area slammed shut, the echo reverberating through the empty corridors of the Drake Mortuary like a gunshot. Olaf was gone. The angry, uneven rhythm of his limping footsteps faded into the humid Chicago night, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy enough to crush my lungs. I stood, completely frozen by the front desk, staring at the closed door. My mind was spinning, struggling to process what had just happened. Olaf hadn't seen her. He had looked straight into the gaping maw of drawer 14, right at the pale, lifeless body of the blonde nurse, and he had seen absolutely nothing but an empty steel tray. He thought I was playing a sick, twisted joke. He thought I was drunk or crazy or both. But I wasn't crazy. I was a rational, science-minded pre-med student. I believed in anatomy, in cellular decay, in pathology. I believed in things I could touch, measure, and observe under a microscope. I did not believe in phantoms. Yet my eyes had seen her. The image of her delicate, tragic face was burned into my retinas. I slowly walked back to my desk, my legs feeling like they were moving through deep water. I looked down at the ashtray. The 2 cigarettes I had lit earlier in my panic had burned down to the filters, leaving long, unbroken columns of gray ash. It was a physical testament to my frayed nerves. I sank into the cheap leather chair, burying my face in my trembling hands. "Okay, Tully, think," I whispered to the empty room, my voice sounding incredibly small. "Think this through logically. Hallucinations. What causes hallucinations?" I rattled off the medical causes in my head like I was prepping for an exam. Severe sleep deprivation. Check. I had been pulling double shifts between the mortuary and the university lab for 3 weeks straight. Extreme stress. Check. Finals were looming, and the pressure was eating me alive. Chemical exposure. Check. I breathed in formaldehyde and industrial cleaners 8 hours a night. It made perfect sense. My exhausted brain had simply misfired. I had stared into a dark, empty drawer, and my subconscious, fueled by the morbid atmosphere of the morgue and Olaf's creepy story about the sulphur-smelling witch, had projected an image to fill the void. The nurse wasn't real. She was just a phantom born from fatigue. Taking a deep breath, I felt a sudden surge of false bravado. I needed to prove to myself that my mind was playing tricks on me. If I went back into the cold room right now, with a clear head and a steady pulse, drawer 14 would be empty. It had to be. I stood up, grabbed my heavy metal flashlight from the desk, more for the psychological comfort of holding a weapon than for actual light, and marched back toward the swinging doors of the cold room. The low mechanical hum of the massive industrial compressors grew louder as I approached. I pushed the door open. The blast of frigid air hit me like a physical blow, instantly raising goosebumps on my arms beneath my thin scrub top. I didn't hesitate. I walked straight down the center aisle, my rubber-soled boots squeaking faintly against the pristine linoleum floor. I kept my eyes locked on the far wall until I was standing directly in front of the pulled-out drawer. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 3, and opened them. My heart completely stopped. The flashlight slipped from my sweaty grip, clattering loudly onto the floor and rolling away, its beam casting erratic, dancing shadows across the steel cabinets. She was still there. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the fluorescent bulbs. The young blonde nurse was lying exactly as I had left her. My scientific rationalization crumbled into dust, replaced by a primal, icy terror that seized me by the throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. She was so incredibly vivid, so undeniably physically present, that the idea of her being an illusion was laughable. I could see the subtle, individual strands of her golden hair resting against the frosted metal of the tray. I could see the crisp, white fabric of her old-fashioned nurse's uniform, slightly wrinkled at the waist. I could see the pale, almost translucent quality of her skin, untouched by the usual dark, mottled pooling of blood, livor mortis, that always affected the bodies brought in here. She looked too perfect, too preserved. And then there was the smell. It was stronger now. It wasn't the chemical stench of embalming fluid or the sickly sweet odor of decay. It was the sharp, burning, metallic stench of sulphur. It clawed at the back of my nostrils, exactly as Olaf had described. Why me? The thought echoed loudly in my panicked brain. In my grandfather's old superstitious tales back in my hometown, he used to say that the dead only reveal themselves to those who share a frequency with them, or to those who are inexplicably chosen by fate to carry their burden. They called it a karmic tether. I had always laughed off those old ghost stories. But standing here in the freezing morgue of a modern Chicago hospital, science felt utterly useless. I leaned in closer, drawn by a terrifying, morbid curiosity that overrode my instinct to run. My face was only inches from hers. The temperature around the drawer seemed to plummet even further, the air growing so dense and freezing that my breath plumed into thick white clouds. I focused on the silver chain bracelet resting on her cold, motionless wrist. The letters ZL were engraved with elegant, sweeping loops. Slowly, against every screaming alarm bell in my head, I reached my right hand out. My fingers trembled violently. I didn't want to touch her skin. I just wanted to touch the cold metal of the drawer, to prove that the space she occupied was solid. As my fingertips hovered just a fraction of an inch above her arm, a violent shockwave of freezing energy snapped through the room. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently, buzzing like an angry hornet's nest, plunging the cold room into rapid, strobe-like darkness. Bzzz, flash. Bzzz, flash. Simultaneously, out in the reception area, my small battery-operated radio roared to life. It wasn't playing the late-night jazz station I usually left it on. It was blasting a wall of deafening, aggressive static. I yanked my hand back as if I had touched a live electrical wire. I stumbled backward, my boots slipping on the slick floor, and I fell hard onto my back, the wind knocked out of my lungs. The lights stabilized. The loud static from the radio abruptly cut off, plunging the mortuary back into that crushing, oppressive silence. I lay there on the freezing floor, staring up at the harsh ceiling lights, my chest heaving as I gasped for air. My mind was entirely blank, reduced to pure, unadulterated animal fear. "Get up," my brain commanded. "Get up and run out the front door. Never come back." I scrambled to my feet, my knees shaking so badly I could barely support my own weight. I didn't bother grabbing my flashlight. I backed away from drawer 14, never taking my eyes off the blonde nurse, terrified that if I turned my back, she would sit up and grab me. I practically fell through the swinging doors, stumbling back into the warmer air of the reception room. I slammed the door shut behind me, leaning my entire body weight against it, as if my frail frame could keep whatever was in there from getting out. I was panting, sweating profusely, despite the lingering cold in my bones. I stared wildly around the familiar office. The desk, the logbook, the thermos, everything looked so painfully normal, yet the reality I knew had been completely fractured. I walked over to the radio. The power switch was firmly clicked to the off position. I hadn't even turned it on tonight. My hands shaking uncontrollably, I poured another cup of black coffee. It tasted like ash. I sat back down in the leather chair, pulling my knees up and wrapping my arms around them, trying to stop the shivering. I looked at the heavy, leather-bound logbook sitting under the desk lamp. Olaf hadn't seen her, because she wasn't meant for Olaf. She was meant for me. The realization settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The blank toe tag. The smell of sulphur, inherited from the fourth Witch of Endor, who had occupied that exact same space just days prior. This wasn't a random haunting. This was a deliberate manifestation. I pulled the logbook toward me. I flipped past the current day, past the week, and started going backward. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I needed an anchor, some piece of historical data to explain the impossible. I scoured the records for months back, looking for any female intake with the initials ZL, any nurse who had died violently or mysteriously. Nothing. The records were completely clean. Whoever she was, she had never officially been brought to the Drake Mortuary. She existed completely off the grid, trapped between the world of the living and the cold, numbered drawers of the dead. The antique wall clock above the door ticked loudly. Tick-tock. Tick-tock. It was 2:15 a.m. I still had nearly 6 hours left of my shift. 6 hours trapped in this building with an invisible corpse. I rested my head on the open pages of the logbook, closing my eyes, praying to any god that would listen that morning would come quickly. Then I heard it. It was faint but unmistakable in the absolute quiet of the building. Shk. It was the distinct metallic sound of heavy-duty steel bearings rolling on a track. It came from the cold room. My blood ran instantly to ice. I stopped breathing. I sat perfectly still, every muscle in my body paralyzed with terror. Shk, clack. The sound of a drawer sliding shut. I slowly lifted my head from the desk. My eyes drifted toward the 2 small reinforced windows on the upper half of the cold room door. The bright fluorescent light spilled out from the glass, illuminating a rectangular patch on the reception floor. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to run out into the Chicago streets and never look back. But the morbid, terrifying curiosity, the very thing that makes us slow down to look at a car crash, pulled me out of my chair. I walked toward the door on trembling legs, moving as silently as a ghost myself. I pressed my back flat against the wall next to the door, hesitating for a long, agonizing moment. Then, I slowly turned my head and peered through the thick glass window. Drawer 14 was perfectly, securely closed. The heavy metal handle sat flush against the cabinet. The blank cardboard toe tag dangled slightly, swaying gently in the unseen currents of the air conditioning. The blonde nurse was gone. She had retreated back into the darkness of the steel tomb. But as I stared at the closed drawer, a new, far more terrifying realization hit me. A body cannot close its own drawer from the outside. And if she was truly inside, trapped in that freezing dark, she wasn't just a vision anymore. She was active. She was moving. And she knew I was watching. The remaining 6 hours of my shift that night were a masterclass in psychological torture. I did not move from the reception desk. I sat rigidly in that cheap, squeaky leather chair, my eyes glued to the heavy wooden doors that separated me from the cold room. Every time the ancient Chicago building settled, every time the pipes groaned or the massive refrigeration units kicked into a higher gear, my heart slammed against my ribs like a trapped bird. I kept expecting the doors to slowly swing open. I kept expecting to see that crisp, white nurse's uniform materializing in the dim hallway light, bringing with it the sickening, burning stench of sulphur. But she didn't come out. The drawer remained shut. By the time the sun finally began to bleed through the high, grimy windows of the morgue, painting the concrete floor in pale shades of gray, I felt like I had aged 10 years. At exactly 8 a.m., the heavy front door swung open, and Dave, the daytime attendant, strolled in holding a large Dunkin' Donuts coffee and a heavily powdered pastry. "Morning, Tully," Dave chirped, oblivious to the fact that I was gripping the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles were white. "Quiet night?" "Yeah," I lied, my voice sounding like crushed gravel. "Quiet. All yours, Dave." I practically sprinted out of the building. The biting morning wind coming off Lake Michigan hit my face, and for the first time in hours, I took a full, deep breath. The bustling sounds of the city, the distant roar of the L train, the honking of yellow cabs, the chatter of people hurrying to their offices, were usually a nuisance, but today they were the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. It was the sound of the living. Normally, after a night shift, I would head straight to my cramped, overpriced apartment in Logan Square, collapse onto my unmade bed, and sleep until my afternoon lectures. But sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. If I closed my eyes, I knew exactly what I would see. The pale face, the closed eyes, the silver bracelet with the letters ZL. If I wanted to keep my sanity, I needed to understand what I was dealing with. In my family, my folks always used to say that ghosts don't haunt places, they haunt people. And they don't reach out unless there is a profound, unresolved grievance, a karmic debt that needs balancing. If this girl was reaching out to me, making herself visible only to my eyes, there had to be a reason. Instead of going home, I walked 6 blocks to the university's main library. It was a massive, imposing Gothic structure that always smelled of floor wax and old, decaying paper. I headed straight down to the basement archives, where the historical records and newspaper microfilms were kept. The basement was empty, save for a sleepy librarian reading a paperback romance novel. I took a seat at one of the bulky microfilm reader machines, turned on the glaring backlight, and began the tedious process of spooling decades-old local newspapers. I didn't have much to go on. A blonde nurse, the initials ZL, and a bizarre connection to the fourth witch of Endor, the old woman who had jumped off her apartment roof and briefly occupied drawer 14 before this phantom nurse took her place. I decided to start my search by looking into the neighborhood where the old witch had lived. It was a rougher part of the South Side, a place known for transient residents and forgotten histories. I scanned through obituaries, police blotters, and hospital records from the past few decades, looking for anything related to a nurse in that area. Hours bled away. My eyes burned from staring at the glowing screen. The text blurred together into a meaningless soup of tragic headlines: gang violence, fires, political corruption. I was about to give up, attributing the whole night to a spectacular mental breakdown, when a small, buried article from the Chicago Tribune, dated October 14, 1982, caught my eye. The headline read, "Local nurse vanishes amidst malpractice scandal." My breath hitched in my throat. I leaned in, adjusting the focus dial until the grainy text became sharp. There was a black and white photograph attached to the article. Even through the poor quality of the microfilm, I recognized her instantly. It was the same delicate face, the same thick blonde hair, the same uniform. Her name was Zelda Lawson, Z.L. I quickly read through the column. Zelda Lawson, 24, was a dedicated surgical nurse at a nearby charity hospital. She was described by her colleagues as brilliant, compassionate, and deeply devoted to her patients. However, in late September of 1982, a routine surgery went catastrophically wrong. A patient died on the operating table due to a lethal dosage of anesthesia. The hospital, desperate to avoid a massive lawsuit, needed a scapegoat. The attending surgeon, a wealthy man with powerful connections in the city, successfully shifted the entire blame onto the young, inexperienced nurse. Zelda was publicly disgraced, stripped of her medical license, and faced impending criminal charges for manslaughter. But the article contained a chilling detail that made the blood freeze in my veins. The patient who had died on the operating table was a woman named Ilara Vance. According to the article, Ilara Vance was a well-known figure in the South Side community, a woman who claimed to be a spiritual medium and a practitioner of the dark arts. The mother of the fourth witch of Endor, the connection was absolute. It was a chain of tragedy forged in 1982 that had somehow snapped back into reality 40 years later in Drawer 14. The article concluded by stating that, on the night before her criminal trial, Zelda Lawson simply vanished from her apartment. She left all her belongings behind, including her purse, her car, and her beloved pet cat. The police suspected suicide, assuming she had thrown herself into the icy waters of the Chicago River to avoid prison. But her body was never recovered. Until last night. I slumped back in the wooden library chair, rubbing my temples. The pieces of the puzzle were terrifyingly clear. Zelda didn't commit suicide. The witches of that family didn't forgive. The old woman who had jumped off the roof last week, the daughter of the woman who died on Zelda's operating table, had carried a generational curse. When she died and was placed in Drawer 14, the dark energy she carried somehow acted as a beacon, summoning the trapped, restless spirit of the woman who had allegedly killed her mother. Zelda was trapped in a cycle of unnatural vengeance, and somehow, by standing in that morgue and looking into her eyes, I had stumbled right into the middle of it. I printed a copy of the article, shoved it into my jacket pocket, and finally left the library. It was past noon, but the Chicago sky had turned a bruising, stormy purple. A heavy rain was beginning to fall, washing the grime from the streets. I rode the L train back to Logan Square, my mind racing. I told myself that knowing the history gave me power. Now that I knew who she was, I could rationalize it. I just had to avoid Drawer 14. I could ask Olaf to switch wings with me, or I could just quit. Olaf had told me to find a new job anyway. I could walk away and let the dead sort out their own debts. I unlocked the door to my apartment. It was a typical student setup. A cramped studio, a small kitchenette with a dripping faucet, and a radiator in the corner that hissed and clanked like a dying asthmatic. It was messy, cluttered with medical textbooks, unwashed coffee mugs, and piles of laundry. But it was mine. It was a sanctuary of the living. I locked the deadbolt, threw my wet jacket over a chair, and collapsed onto my mattress. Exhaustion finally overtook my fear. The moment my head hit the pillow, the heavy curtain of sleep fell over me. I don't know how long I slept, but I woke up abruptly. It wasn't a natural awakening. It was that sharp, violent jolt of consciousness you experience when your primal instincts detect a predator in the room. My eyes snapped open, staring at the water-stained ceiling of my apartment. The room was pitch black. The storm outside had knocked out the street lights, plunging my studio into absolute darkness. But it wasn't the darkness that woke me. It was the cold. The hissing radiator had gone completely silent. The ambient temperature in my apartment had plummeted so drastically that I could see the faint white plumes of my own breath in the dark. It felt exactly like the air inside the mortuary's cold room. I lay perfectly still, my muscles rigid. I tried to swallow, but my throat was painfully dry. Then I smelled it. It crept under the crack of my apartment door, thick and suffocating. It wasn't the smell of old takeout or damp laundry. It was the sharp, metallic, eye-watering stench of burning sulfur. No, I thought, panic rising in my chest like a tidal wave. No, 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 you can't be here. You're bound to the morgue. But the spiritual world, as I was rapidly learning, doesn't care about the physical boundaries of concrete and steel. If a spirit latches onto your energy, if you form a karmic tether by acknowledging their existence, they can follow you anywhere. I heard a sound. Shh. It was faint, coming from the direction of my kitchenette. It sounded exactly like the heavy steel bearings of a morgue drawer sliding on its tracks. But I didn't have steel drawers in my kitchen. I only had cheap wooden cabinets. Shh. Clack. I slowly turned my head. My eyes strained against the darkness, trying to make out the shapes of my furniture. Then, the mattress beside me slowly depressed. It wasn't a sudden drop. It was the slow, deliberate sinking of the springs, exactly as if someone, or something, was gently sitting down on the edge of my bed. The heavy, freezing weight settled right next to my hip. I couldn't breathe. My heart was beating so fast and so hard, I thought my ribs would crack. I was completely paralyzed by a fear so profound, it bypassed my brain and settled directly into my bones. "I know you're there," a voice whispered. It didn't come from the edge of the bed. It didn't come from the kitchen. It echoed directly inside my own head, a soft, sorrowful, feminine voice that sounded like it was speaking through a layer of cold water. "They put me in the dark," the voice murmured, the sadness in it so heavy it felt palpable. "For 40 years I was in the dark, and then she came, the witch. She brought the dark with her." Tears of pure terror pricked my eyes. I squeezed them shut, praying for the sun, praying for a neighbor to drop a pan, praying for anything to break the silence. The weight on the mattress shifted. It moved closer. I could feel the unnatural, radiating cold pressing against my side through the thin blanket. "You saw me," Zelda's voice echoed in my mind again. "The old man couldn't see. The others couldn't see. But your eyes are open, Tully. You hold the tether." Suddenly, the suffocating smell of sulphur vanished, replaced instantly by the sterile, chemical scent of hospital-grade disinfectant. I felt a touch. It was lighter than a feather, but it sent a shock of ice-cold electricity shooting through my entire nervous system. Cold, stiff fingers gently brushed against my forehead, pushing a stray lock of hair out of my eyes. "Help me," she whispered, and this time the voice was accompanied by a desperate, agonizing sob that tore at my humanity beneath the terror. "Please, the witch, she's coming back for the drawer. If she takes it, I will burn forever. You have to open the door, Tully. You have to let me out." The pressure on the mattress vanished instantly. The freezing temperature dissipated, replaced by the muggy, stale air of the Chicago summer storm. The radiator in the corner sputtered and clanked back to life, hissing out a stream of warm air. I shot up in bed, frantically fumbling for the bedside lamp. I clicked the switch. Yellow light flooded the small studio. I was completely alone. The apartment was empty. The kitchenette cabinets were closed. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I sat on the edge of the bed, shaking uncontrollably, gasping for air as if I had just surfaced from drowning. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling violently. I looked over at the chair where I had thrown my wet jacket. Sticking out of the pocket was the folded printout from the library, the grainy black and white picture of Zelda Lawson. I now understood the horrific reality of my situation. This wasn't a ghost story I could walk away from. Quitting my job at the Drake Mortuary wouldn't save me. Zelda Lawson wasn't confined to drawer 14. She was tethered to me. The fourth witch of Endor had used the mortuary as a ritual site to condemn Zelda's soul to eternal torment, and by opening that drawer, I had accidentally interrupted the process. Zelda was begging for salvation, and if I didn't go back to the morgue tonight and figure out how to break the curse, the witch wouldn't just claim Zelda. She would claim me, too. I stared at the antique clock on my wall. It was 4 p.m. I had 8 hours before my next midnight shift began.
8 hours to figure out how to fight a 40-year-old curse in a room full of corpses.
There is a distinct metallic taste to pure terror. It coats the back of your tongue like an old copper penny, an inescapable reminder that your body's primal alarms are blaring. By the time 5 p.m. rolled around, that taste was all I knew. I was no longer just a struggling pre-med student at the University of Chicago trying to memorize the intricacies of the human nervous system. I had unwillingly become a player in a 40-year-old supernatural vendetta. Zelda Lawson, the disgraced nurse from 1982, was tethered to me, and the fourth witch of Endor, the woman who had splattered herself on the pavement just a week ago, was the architect of this nightmare. I needed to understand the mechanics of the trap I had stumbled into. In the Vietnamese neighborhood where my best friend grew up, the elders always spoke of Ngip, karma, a spiritual debt that spans generations and refuses to be ignored until the balance is paid in full. To Western minds, we call it a curse. But whatever the terminology, the rules of the dead are universally rigid. I needed an expert in those rules. Instead of going back to sleep, I forced myself out into the dreary Chicago evening. The rain had subsided into a miserable, freezing drizzle. I took the L train down to a gritty, industrial stretch of the South Side, near the neighborhood where the old witch had lived. Tucked between a boarded-up pawn shop and a dimly lit liquor store was a narrow storefront with peeling gold-leaf lettering on the glass. Arcana and Antiquities. A bell jingled harshly as I pushed the door open. The air inside was thick with the scent of burning sage, myrrh, and old, decaying paper. Behind a glass counter overflowing with crystals, dried herbs, and tattered tarot decks, sat an elderly woman with sharp, bird-like features and eyes completely clouded over with cataracts. "We're closed," she rasped, not even turning her head toward me. "I'm not here to buy anything," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I need information about a woman who lived around here. She called herself the fourth witch of Endor." The old woman's hand stopped shuffling a stack of yellowed papers. The silence in the shop became instantly suffocating. Slowly, she turned her blind eyes in my direction, her expression hardening into a mask of pure dread. "Agatha Vance," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the drone of the ancient space heater at her feet. "That was her name? The daughter of Ilara. You shouldn't be speaking that name."
Boy, not while her grave is still fresh.
"I don't have a choice," I replied, stepping closer to the counter. "She was brought to the city mortuary last week. I work the night shift there. Something was left behind in her drawer 14. The old woman inhaled sharply, her gnarled hands gripping the edge of the glass counter. "Mother of mercy," she breathed. "She actually did it. The crazy old bat actually completed the cycle. Completed what? I demanded, the desperation bleeding into my voice. Please, I saw a nurse, a blonde nurse named Zelda Lawson. She died 40 years ago after Agatha's mother died on her operating table. Now her spirit is trapped in that drawer, and she followed me home. The shop owner shook her head, a grim, humorless smile touching her lips. She didn't follow you home, boy. You pulled her out. You became the conduit. She reached beneath the counter and pulled out a heavy leather-bound grimoire, its pages brittle with age. Listen to me carefully. Ilara Vance, the mother, was a practitioner of the dark arts, a medium who dealt in blood magic and curses. When she died on that operating table in 1982, her daughter Agatha swore a blood oath to avenge her. But Agatha knew that simply killing the nurse wouldn't be enough. Death is too easy. Death is a release. The old woman ran her trembling fingers over the blind embossed symbols on the book's cover. Agatha wanted Zelda to suffer eternally. She performed a ritual of condemnation. When Zelda mysteriously vanished before her trial, she didn't commit suicide. Agatha abducted her, ritually bound her soul, and murdered her. She cast Zelda's spirit into a liminal space, a dark, freezing purgatory between our world and the next. But to keep her there, Agatha had to anchor the curse to her own bloodline. I felt the blood drain from my face. So, as long as Agatha was alive, Zelda was trapped in the dark. Exactly, the old woman nodded gravely. But Agatha grew old. She knew her natural death was approaching. If she simply died in her sleep, the curse would break, and Zelda's soul would be freed to find peace. Agatha couldn't allow that. She needed to make the purgatory permanent. She needed to execute the final stage of the ritual, the substitution of the damned. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The roof, I whispered. She jumped off the roof. It wasn't a suicide, the old woman corrected me, her blind eyes seeming to pierce right through my skull. It was a calculated geographical sacrifice. She timed her death perfectly. She threw herself off that building, knowing her unclaimed, shattered body would be taken to the county morgue. She knew they would put her in one of those freezing iron drawers. Iron and cold, boy. They trap spirits. Drawer 14 wasn't just a resting place for Agatha. She turned it into a spiritual gateway. A gateway to where? To the void, she rasped. Agatha infected that metal drawer with her own dark energy, the smell of burning sulphur. When her distant relative finally came to claim her body, the physical corpse was removed, but the gateway remained open. Agatha had successfully swapped places. She descended to whatever dark hell awaited her, and in her place, she pulled Zelda's trapped soul up from the depths and locked it inside drawer 14. I staggered back, bumping into a bookshelf. The sheer calculating malice of the 40-year plan was staggering. But why me? Why can I see her when Olaf, the old guy who works with me, can't? Because the ritual required a witness to seal the door, the shopkeeper explained, her voice dropping to a somber whisper. A gateway between the living and the dead cannot be permanently locked from the inside. It requires a living soul to interact with it. By opening that drawer, by reading that blank tag, by looking into Zelda's eyes, you acknowledged the threshold. You became the final padlock on Zelda's eternal prison. The curse tethered itself to your life force. How do I break it? I asked, my voice cracking. She begged me to help her. She said the witch is coming back for the drawer. Agatha's residual energy, the witch's shadow, We'll try to consume the drawer to make the curse permanent by sunrise tomorrow, she warned. If you don't sever the tether tonight, Zelda will burn in hellfire forever. And because your soul is now tied to the door, when the witch drags Zelda down, she will drag you down with her. She reached into a wooden box on the counter and pulled out a small, heavy iron skeleton key and a handful of coarse sea salt mixed with crushed dried sage. She shoved them into my trembling hands. Iron grounds the spirit. Salt purifies the threshold, she instructed. You must go back to the morgue tonight. You must open drawer 14 one last time. You must face the witch's shadow, and you must command Zelda's spirit to cross over before the gateway collapses.
If you fail, boy,
They won't just find a dead nurse in that drawer tomorrow morning. They'll find you. I left the shop with the iron key burning a hole in my pocket. The train ride back north felt like a death march. The city of Chicago, with its towering skyscrapers and millions of beating hearts, felt incredibly distant, as if I were already fading from the world of the living. I arrived at the Drake Mortuary at exactly 11:45 p.m. The building looked more menacing than ever before. The concrete facade seemed to absorb the sickly yellow glow of the street lamps, casting long, unnatural shadows across the wet pavement. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the reception area. The air inside was completely stagnant, heavy with a tension so thick it felt like I was walking through deep water. Olaf was sitting at the desk. He didn't look up when I walked in. He was staring blankly at the wall, his face a pale ashen gray. He looked 10 years older than he had yesterday. His usually steady hands were shaking so badly that the coffee in his mug was spilling over the rim, staining the daily logbook. "Olaf?" I asked gently, setting my backpack on the floor. He slowly turned his head. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a profound, unspoken terror. He knew. He hadn't seen Zelda, but he had felt the shift in the building. He had felt the unnatural cold creeping through the concrete floors. Animals and old men often sense the predator long before the young and arrogant do. "I'm leaving," Olaf muttered, his voice a hoarse whisper. He didn't bother giving me the usual rundown of the day's intake. He didn't make a snide comment about my college classes. He just stood up, his bad leg trembling violently. "Olaf, wait!" "Don't go in the back, Branson," he interrupted, grabbing his heavy winter coat. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Just sit at the desk, keep the radio on. Don't look at the doors. God help me, I should have retired 5 years ago." Without another word, he hobbled past me, threw the front door open, and disappeared into the rainy night, leaving me entirely alone with the dead. The silence he left behind was deafening. I walked over to the desk. The logbook was open. The pages were completely blank for the day, save for a single dark stain of spilled coffee that looked eerily like a gaping, screaming mouth. I checked the wall clock. 12 a.m., the witching hour. Almost immediately, the temperature in the reception room began to plummet. I could see my breath pluming in the air. The heavy, wooden swinging doors leading to the cold room groaned, the wood warping and protesting under an invisible, freezing pressure. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't a subtle hint this time. It was a violent, overpowering wave of pure, burning sulphur. It smelled like rotten eggs violently combusting. It stung my eyes, bringing tears to my face, and burned the back of my throat so badly I doubled over, coughing and gagging. But beneath that demonic stench, fighting a desperate, losing battle, was the faint, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and white linen. Zelda. Shh. The sound echoed through the heavy wooden doors. Shh. The massive metal bearings of drawer 14 were grinding against their tracks. But this time, it wasn't a gentle slide. It sounded like the metal was being forced, warped, and torn by an immense, unnatural strength. I pulled the heavy iron skeleton key and the handful of salt from my pocket. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped them. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run out the front door, to chase after Olaf and abandon this cursed place. But I remembered the desperate, icy touch of Zelda's fingers on my forehead in my apartment. I remembered the agonizing sorrow in her voice. She was an innocent woman, scapegoated in life and tortured in death, entirely because a vindictive family couldn't accept their own mortality. If I ran now, I would be no better than the corrupt surgeon who had framed her 40 years ago. I would be abandoning her to the dark. I took a deep, shuddering breath, filling my lungs with the toxic toward the swinging doors, pushing them open with both hands. The cold room was unrecognizable. The bright fluorescent lights had completely failed, replaced by a strobing, sickly green emergency glow that bathed the room in a nauseating underwater hue. A thick, swirling mist of freezing fog rolled across the pristine linoleum floor, creeping up the sides of the stainless steel gurneys. And at the far end of the room, standing at the epicenter of the unnatural maelstrom, was drawer 14. The drawer was violently vibrating, rattling against its housing with a deafening metallic clatter. The stainless steel faceplate was completely covered in a thick layer of black, jagged frost. The blank cardboard toe tag was whipping wildly in an invisible, localized hurricane. As I stepped further into the room, the temperature dropped to a level that physically hurt my skin. The mist parted slightly, and I saw her. Zelda was not lying peacefully in the drawer anymore. She was standing in front of it. Her blonde hair was whipping around her pale face, her white nurse's uniform glowing faintly in the dark. But she was not alone. Behind her, emerging from the gaping black void of the open drawer, was a towering, writhing mass of pure shadow. It had no face, no distinct shape, only a pair of glowing, malevolent, hateful red eyes. It reeked of sulphur and decay. The witch's shadow. The manifestation of Agatha Vance's generational curse. Long, tendril-like claws of black smoke were wrapped tightly around Zelda's waist, pulling her backward, dragging her agonizingly slowly toward the abyss of the drawer. Zelda was fighting it, her translucent hands clawing desperately at the smooth metal of the cabinets, her face contorted in a silent scream of absolute agony. She looked at me, her dark, beautiful eyes locked onto mine, pleading for the salvation I had promised. The shadow entity noticed me. The glowing red eyes snapped toward my direction. A sound like grinding stones and roaring flames filled the room, shaking the very foundation of the Drake Mortuary. The gateway was open. The final battle for a soul had begun, and I was the only thing standing between an innocent girl and an eternity of hellfire. I tightened my grip on the iron key, raised my hand full of salt, and sprinted straight toward the darkness. Midnight shift's end. There is a profound, terrifying difference between reading about the supernatural in a dusty library basement and actually facing it in the freezing, flickering gloom of a city morgue. As I sprinted across the linoleum floor of the cold room, the air pressure dropped so violently that my ears popped. The sickening, underwater green hue of the emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to claw at my ankles with every step I took. The entity towering over Zelda Lawson was not a ghost in the traditional sense. It was a manifestation of pure, concentrated malice. A 40-year-old grudge sustained by blood magic and sealed by a geographical sacrifice. The witch's shadow possessed no human features, but its sheer density warped the space around it. The freezing fog in the room was being sucked into its dark, shifting mass, swirling like a localized hurricane directly in front of Drawer 14. "Get away from her!" I screamed, the sound of my own voice barely piercing the deafening metallic rattle of the steel drawers vibrating against their tracks. The glowing red eyes within the shadow snapped toward me. A wave of force, cold and hard as a concrete wall, slammed into my chest. I was thrown backward, my boots skidding across the slick floor. I hit the edge of a stainless steel gurney, the impact knocking the wind out of my lungs. My vision blurred, black spots dancing at the edges of my sight. The stench of burning sulphur was so thick, it felt like I was inhaling volcanic ash. I could hear the shadow moving toward me, a sound like grinding stones and snapping bones. It had recognized the threat I posed. I was the witness. I was the living padlock holding the gateway open, and it needed to consume me to make the curse permanent. "Help!" The voice was faint, a desperate whisper echoing directly into my mind. I forced my eyes open. Through the swirling black mist, I saw Zelda. The tendrils of dark energy were wrapped tightly around her throat and wrists, dragging her agonizingly backward into the gaping black void of Drawer 14. Her pristine white nurse's uniform was turning gray, infected by the witch's corruption. Her eyes, filled with an eternity of sorrow, locked onto mine. I remembered the old woman at Arcana and Antiquities. Iron grounds the spirit. Salt purifies the threshold. I gritted my teeth, ignoring the agonizing pain radiating from my bruised ribs, and forced myself to my feet. My right hand was clenched so tightly around the heavy iron skeleton key that the metal was biting into my palm. My left hand held the mixture of coarse sea salt and crushed dried sage. "You have no claim to her," I roared, pushing through the wall of freezing air. The shadow lunged, a massive, shapeless arm of darkness sweeping down toward my head. I threw my left hand forward, hurling the handful of salt and sage directly into the center of the mass. The reaction was instantaneous and violently explosive. The moment the consecrated salt made contact with the shadow, a blinding flash of white light erupted in the dim room. A sound like 1,000 panes of glass shattering at once echoed off the concrete walls. The shadow shrieked, a high, piercing wail that sounded terrifyingly human, like an old woman plummeting to her death. The dark tendrils wrapped around Zelda instantly dissolved into ash. She collapsed to the floor, coughing and gasping for air that she no longer needed, her translucent form flickering like a dying television signal. "The drawer, Tully!" she cried out, pointing a trembling, pale finger toward the open metal tray. "Close the gateway!" The shadow was recoiling, writhing in agony where the salt had burned it. But it was already beginning to reform, drawing new strength from the residual dark energy embedded in the iron drawer. I didn't have much time. I dove forward, sliding on my knees across the freezing floor until I slammed into the metal cabinet housing Drawer 14. The temperature radiating from the open drawer was absolute zero. Frost instantly began to crystallize on my eyelashes and the fabric of my scrubs. I grabbed the heavy metal handle of the drawer with my left hand. It was so cold it burned, searing my flesh like a hot iron. I screamed in pain, but I refused to let go. I planted my boots against the floor and pushed with every ounce of strength I possessed. The drawer resisted. It felt as though I were trying to push a parked freight train. The shadow, recovering from the salt, surged forward, its glowing red eyes burning with a hateful, demonic fury. It wrapped invisible, freezing hands around my throat, squeezing with an impossible, crushing pressure. I was choking, my airway completely cut off. "I am the tether," I choked out, my voice a wet, ragged gasp. "I do not consent. I break the bond." With my vision fading to black, I brought up my right hand. I slammed the heavy iron skeleton key directly against the freezing metal faceplate of drawer 14. Iron grounds the spirit. A shockwave of pure kinetic energy blasted outward from the point of contact. The iron key acted like a lightning rod, short-circuiting the dark magic that Agatha Vance had woven into the metal. The invisible hands around my throat instantly vanished. The shadow was pulled backward, screaming in defiant rage, sucked into the very vortex it had created. With a final, desperate roar, I threw my entire body weight against the handle. Shk! Clack! The heavy steel drawer slams shut. The locking mechanism engaged with a loud, definitive snap. Silence fell over the Drake Mortuary like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The sickening green emergency lights flickered, buzzed, and suddenly snapped back to the bright, sterile white of the fluorescent bulbs. The freezing fog instantly dissipated, leaving behind nothing but the faint smell of industrial cleaner. The burning stench of sulphur was entirely gone. I collapsed onto my back, staring up at the harsh ceiling lights, my chest heaving as I desperately sucked in huge lungfuls of clean, breathable air. My whole body was trembling violently. The palm of my left hand was blistered and raw from touching the frozen metal handle. But I was alive. I slowly turned my head. Standing a few feet away, bathed in the harsh fluorescent light, was Zelda. She no longer looked terrified. The sorrow and agony that had haunted her delicate features were gone, replaced by an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. The crisp white of her nurse's uniform glowed softly, untainted by the darkness of the void. She looked down at me, a gentle, beautiful smile touching her lips. She didn't speak. In the realm of spirits, words are often unnecessary. Emotions convey the absolute truth. I felt a wave of immense gratitude wash over me. A warm, comforting current that completely erased the lingering chill in my bones. It was the feeling of a karmic debt finally, irrevocably balanced. She slowly raised her hand, brushing her fingers against the silver bracelet on her wrist. Then she closed her eyes, tilted her head back, and simply dissolved. She didn't fade away like smoke. She scattered like 1,000 tiny particles of golden light, drifting upward until there was absolutely nothing left. The fourth Witch of Endor's curse was broken. Zelda Lawson had finally crossed over. I lay on the floor of the cold room for a long time. The adrenaline slowly drained from my system, leaving behind a crushing, bone-deep exhaustion. I don't know how long I stayed there, listening to the mechanical hum of the refrigerators. Eventually, the heavy, numbing weight of sleep overtook me. When I finally opened my eyes, the cold room was exactly as it should be. A quiet, sterile sanctuary for the dead. I sat up slowly, my muscles screaming in protest. My ribs ached, and my throat felt like I had swallowed broken glass, but I was functioning. I looked at the clock on the far wall. 7:45 a.m. The morning sun was beginning to filter through the high, grimy windows of the outer reception area. The long, terrifying night was over. I had survived. I pushed myself up off the floor and slowly walked out of the cold room, letting the heavy wooden doors swing shut behind me. The reception area looked exactly as I had left it. Olaf's spilled coffee had dried into a dark, sticky puddle on the desk. The radio sat silently in the corner. I walked over to the desk and slumped into the leather chair. I felt a strange, hollow sense of victory. I had faced the absolute darkness and won. I had saved a soul. I couldn't wait to walk out the front doors, feel the Chicago morning sun on my face, and sleep for 3 days straight. Maybe I would even change my major. Medicine felt a little too closely tied to mortality after last night. At exactly 8 a.m., the heavy front doors swung open. Dave, the daytime attendant, strolled in. He was wearing his usual thick winter coat, holding a large Dunkin' Donuts coffee and a paper bag. "Hey, Dave," I croaked, trying to muster a smile. My voice was incredibly weak, barely a whisper. Dave didn't answer. He didn't even look in my direction. He walked right past the desk, his eyes fixed on the floor, shaking his head slowly. He looked unusually pale, and his normal cheerful demeanor was entirely absent. "Dave?" I asked, a sudden cold prickle of unease crawling up the back of my neck. I stood up from the chair. "Are you okay?" He completely ignored me. He walked around to the back of the desk, grabbed a rag, and started wiping up Olaf's dried coffee spill. "Dave, seriously, what's wrong with you?" I reached out and put my hand on his shoulder. Or, at least, I tried to. My fingers didn't connect with the thick fabric of his coat. They passed straight through him, as if he were made of mist. A violent jolt of cold electricity snapped through my arm. I stumbled backward, staring at my hand in absolute horror. I tried to grab the edge of the desk. My fingers slipped through the solid wood. I looked down at my feet. I wasn't casting a shadow. No. Panic, colder and sharper than anything I had felt during the night, seized me. No, no, no. I locked the drawer. I broke the tether. I won! Suddenly, the wail of an ambulance siren pierced the morning air, growing rapidly louder until it stopped abruptly right outside the mortuary's loading bay doors. Dave sighed heavily, tossing the dirty rag into a trash can. He walked over to the wall and hit the heavy green button that opened the industrial rolling door. The metal door groaned and rolled upward, revealing the gray Chicago morning. Two paramedics in heavy navy blue jackets pushed a stainless steel gurney up the concrete ramp and into the reception area. Lying on top of the gurney was a thick black body bag. "Rough morning, Dave," the older paramedic said, taking off his cap and running a hand through his thinning hair. "Got a bad one for you." "Yeah, I heard the dispatch on the scanner," Dave replied, his voice trembling slightly. He looked at the black bag with a profound, heavy sadness. "I still can't believe it. I just saw the kid yesterday. He seemed perfectly fine." "Massive cardiac arrest," the paramedic said, shaking his head. "Happens sometimes, even to the young ones. Stress, maybe. Undiagnosed heart defect. The medical examiner will figure it out. But the weirdest part..." The paramedic paused, glancing nervously toward the wooden doors of the cold room. "What?" Dave asked. "When the cleaning crew found him this morning, lying on the floor in the cold room. His face..." "I've been doing this job for 20 years, Dave. I've never seen an expression of pure terror like that on a dead man. It was like he was literally scared to death. The world around me seemed to tilt and spin. The sound of the paramedics' voices became muffled, as if I were underwater. The substitution of the damned. The old woman's words from the occult shop echoed in my mind with crushing, absolute finality. A gateway between the living and the dead cannot be permanently locked from the inside. It requires a living soul. I had saved Zelda. I had pushed the witch back into the void. But in order to lock the door permanently, the scales of karma demanded a toll. The gateway required a new anchor. The energy of the clash, the sheer, unimaginable terror of facing the abyss, had stopped my heart before the drawer ever clicked shut. I didn't survive the night. I was dead before my hand ever left the key. Dave unzipped the top of the black body bag. I walked forward, my footsteps making absolutely no sound on the linoleum floor. I stood right beside Dave and looked down. Staring blindly up at the ceiling, his skin a pale, waxy gray, his eyes wide open in an expression of frozen, eternal horror, was Tully Branson. My right hand was resting rigidly across my chest, clamped in a death grip around a heavy iron skeleton key. "Which drawer, Dave?" the paramedic asked gently, pulling out his clipboard. Dave stared down at my lifeless face for a long time, swallowing hard. He reached over, grabbed a blank cardboard toe tag, and picked up a pen. "Put him in 14, Dave said quietly. "It's empty." As they wheeled my body toward the swinging wooden doors of the cold room,
I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply stood there in the reception area, watching them go. The living go on, completely oblivious to the unseen world surrounding them. But in the quiet, creeping corners of the world, karma always balances its books. Zelda was free, but the Drake Mortuary had a new night watchman. And this time, my shift would never end.